The Xerian Prime Institute of Advanced Xenobiological Studies had exactly the kind of pretentious name that screamed, "We take ourselves very seriously here." Nestled in the academic district of the galaxy's most insufferably elite university planet, it attracted the cream of the intellectual crop from 47 different civilizations, all of whom had collectively agreed that their advanced brains were simply too sophisticated to be bothered with primitive life forms. Professor Helix Vorthak, whose species had evolved past the need for actual vocal cords, and now communicated through color-shifting neck sacs, stood before his advanced theoretical xenobiology seminar, with the kind of smugness typically reserved for beings who had never been wrong about anything important. His neck sac pulsed a confident azure as he began the semester's opening lecture. As we all understand, he began, his universal translator rendering his chromatic communications in a tone dripping with academic authority. The fundamental principle governing biological complexity throughout the galaxy is quite simple. Primitive organisms lack the sophisticated adaptive mechanisms necessary for true evolutionary flexibility. 23 heads from various species nodded in agreement. Well, the ones that had heads nodded. The crystalline collective's representative simply hummed at a frequency that translated to obviously, while the gas form student from Nebula Sector 7 shifted into what could generously be called an approving swirl. This principle, Vorthak continued, his sac now cycling through pleased purples, forms the bedrock of modern xenobiological theory. Advanced civilizations develop advanced organisms. Primitive worlds produce primitive adaptation. The mathematics of evolutionary pressure clearly demonstrate. The door chimed, and every eye, sensor, and electromagnetic detection organ in the room turned toward the entrance. What walked in could only be described, charitably, as a bipedal disaster. 2 arms, 2 legs, a single head with the kind of symmetrical features that suggested either remarkable genetic luck or a complete inability to evolve past basic bilateral organization. Worse yet, it was wearing what appeared to be some sort of primitive fabric covering instead of proper bio-integrated environmental adaptation gear. Vorthak's neck sac flashed a briefly annoyed orange before settling back to professorial blue. Exchange student from the Sol system has arrived. The human, because that's what the database had labeled this walking evolutionary accident, looked around the room with the kind of wide-eyed expression that suggested either wonder or complete bewilderment. Given what the galactic academic community knew about Sol 3, bewilderment seemed more likely. "I'm sorry I'm late," the human said, its vocal cords producing actual sound waves like some kind of acoustic primitive. "I got a little lost trying to find the right atmospheric processor for this wing." A few snickers rippled through the class. The Xeronians sitting near the front, whose species had eliminated the need for atmospheric breathing entirely 3 millennia ago, made a sound that roughly translated to "how quaint." Vorthak gestured to an empty seat with one of his 4 arms. "Please take a seat. We were just discussing the foundational principles of adaptive complexity theory." The human settled into the bioformed chair, which immediately began adjusting to accommodate its primitive skeletal structure. "Adaptive complexity theory." "Indeed," Vorthak replied, his neck sac brightening with the opportunity to enlighten the clearly undereducated. "The principle that organisms from advanced worlds develop sophisticated biological systems, while those from primitive environments remain locked in basic survival patterns." "Oh," the human said, and something in that simple syllable made several students shift uncomfortably. "That sounds interesting." Vorthak launched back into his lecture, his confidence fully restored. "Consider, for instance, the Altarian phase moths, which can exist simultaneously in 7 dimensions to avoid predation. Or the vegan silicon wolves, whose crystalline neural networks allow them to process quantum probability calculations in real time. These represent true evolutionary sophistication, the kind of adaptive complexity that only emerges from properly advanced biospheres." The class murmured appreciative agreement. After all, they'd all spent considerable time studying these marvels of evolutionary engineering, preparing doctoral theses on the superior adaptive mechanisms of their respective world. Now, Vorthak continued, his teaching rhythm hitting full stride. "Contrast this with primitive worlds like your Sol 3, where organisms remain trapped in basic chemical processes, limited atmospheric breathing, and crude physical adaptation methods. The research clearly shows." "Excuse me," the human interrupted, raising one of its primitive appendages. Could you clarify what you mean by limited atmospheric breathing? Vorthak's neck sac flickered through several colors that roughly translated to "Did this creature just interrupt me?" before settling on a patient yellow. Certainly. Your species, and indeed most life from Sol 3, requires a continuous intake of specific atmospheric gases to maintain biological function. This represents a fundamental limitation, a dependency that prevents true adaptive flexibility. Ah, the human nodded. And the more advanced species here don't have that limitation. Precisely, Vorthak beamed, his sac cycling through satisfied purples. True evolutionary sophistication means transcending such primitive requirements. The human was quiet for a moment, and in that silence, something indefinable settled over the classroom. It wasn't quite tension, but it wasn't comfort either. It was the kind of quiet that preceded uncomfortable questions. "That's fascinating," the human said finally. "I'm looking forward to learning more about these advanced adaptive mechanisms." Professor Vorthak's neck sac pulsed with the deep satisfaction of an educator who had successfully enlightened a primitive mind. The semester was off to an excellent start, and he was confident that by its end, even this backwards creature from Sol 3 would understand the fundamental superiority of advanced biological systems. If he could have seen the future, he might have noticed that the human's expression suggested less enlightenment and more the kind of curiosity that had historically proven inconvenient for established academic orthodoxy. But Professor Vorthak, like most beings who had spent their careers studying the theoretical rather than the practical aspects of adaptation, was about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous questions come from the most seemingly primitive sources. The semester had begun, and nobody in that room had the slightest idea that their foundational understanding of biology was about to be turned completely upside down by a bipedal creature whose species had somehow survived ice ages, asteroid impact, and the kind of environmental chaos that would have sent most advanced civilizations running for their climate-controlled spaceship. But then again, theoretical xenobiologists had never been particularly good at recognizing practical adaptation when it bit them on their evolutionarily superior appendages. The third week of advanced theoretical xenobiology had settled into a comfortable rhythm of intellectual superiority and mutual admiration, at least for 23 of the 24 students. Professor Vorthak's neck sac maintained its usual confident azure as he dove into the day's topic, evolutionary pressure responses in extreme environments. "As we can observe from the data," Vorthak announced, his forearms manipulating a three-dimensional holographic display of various alien biospheres. "Advanced species respond to environmental stress through sophisticated biological modification. The Andromedan gas weavers, for instance, simply relocate their consciousness to alternative dimensional planes when faced with atmospheric toxicity." Appreciative murmurs filled the room. Yendri, a crystalline being whose doctoral thesis focused on consciousness-shifting mechanisms, resonated at a frequency that translated roughly to brilliant evolutionary strategy. The collective wisdom of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations nodded in agreement. Similarly, Vorthak continued, clearly enjoying his audience's rapt attention, the Centaurian void swimmers respond to temperature extremes by temporarily dissolving their molecular structure and reconstituting at more favorable thermal coordinates. "Excuse me," came that now familiar voice from the back row. Every sensory organ in the room turned toward the human, who had raised its primitive appendage again. "When you say temporarily dissolving their molecular structure, how long can they maintain that?" Vorthak's neck sac flickered slightly. "Well, the research indicates approximately 14 standard time units before requiring reconstitution." 14 hours. The human sounded genuinely curious. "And what happens if the environmental conditions haven't improved by then?" A brief pause settled over the classroom. It was the kind of pause that suggested nobody had actually considered this particular variable before. Vorthak's sac cycled through several colors that roughly translated to "Why is this primitive asking practical questions? They'll relocate to more suitable environments." Vorthak replied, his confidence slightly less azure than before. "Ah," the human nodded. "So they need to be able to travel to those environments within 14 hours, or they die." That's an oversimplification of a complex I'm just trying to understand, the human interrupted with the kind of innocent tone that made several students shift uncomfortably in their bioformed seats. It sounds like they're really well adapted for short-term environmental changes, but maybe not so much for long-term ones. The Zeronian near the front made a dismissive sound that translated roughly to typical primitive thinking, but somehow it came out sounding less confident than usual. Vorthak's neck sack was now cycling through colors that suggested mild irritation, mixed with academic uncertainty. Moving on, Vorthak announced, manipulating the holodisplay to show a new set of data. Let's examine temperature adaptation. The polar nebula species have developed the ability to hibernate through extreme cold periods by reducing their metabolic processes to near zero levels. How extreme? The human asked immediately. Extremely cold, Vorthak replied, his sack flashing annoyed orange. Temperatures that would instantly kill primitive organisms. Like how cold? I mean in actual numbers. Vorthak consulted his datapad. Approximately -47 degrees in your primitive temperature scale. The human was quiet for a moment. That's not actually that cold. A ripple of what could generously be called confused laughter went through the class. The idea that a creature from a backwater world would consider -47 degrees, not that cold, was clearly the height of primitive ignorance. I assure you, Vorthak said, his neck sack brightening with renewed confidence. -47 degrees is lethal to most known life forms. Oh, I'm not disagreeing, the human said quickly. It's definitely cold enough to kill most things. I was just wondering about organisms that actually live in places that cold regularly. That would be impossible, declared Yendri, her crystalline structure vibrating with scientific certainty. No biological organism could maintain complex functions at such extreme temperatures without sophisticated technological augmentation. Right, the human agreed. That makes sense. So these polar nebula species, they're from a world that occasionally gets down to -47 degrees. And they've evolved hibernation to survive those extreme periods. Precisely, Vorthak beamed, his academic authority fully restored. And they're considered highly adapted because they can survive these occasional extreme temperatures by essentially shutting down. Correct. It represents a sophisticated evolutionary response to environmental pressure. The human nodded thoughtfully. I was just wondering, what would you call an organism that could stay active and functional at temperatures way below that, like say -150 degrees? The classroom fell silent, not the comfortable silence of shared superior knowledge, but the uncomfortable silence of beings who were starting to suspect they might be missing something important. Such an organism would be theoretically impossible. Vorthak said slowly, his neck sack cycling through colors that suggested he was accessing his database of known life forms. The biochemical processes required for active biological function cannot operate at such temperatures without massive technological intervention. Oh, the human said, that makes sense. I mean, you're the experts. Something in that simple phrase made the entire room feel suddenly warmer. Despite the optimal atmospheric controls, it was the kind of warmth that came from the uncomfortable realization that maybe, just maybe, there were gaps in their collective expertise. However, the human continued. I'm curious about organisms that have been found in really extreme environments. Like hypothetically, what if there were creatures that could survive in the vacuum of space? Or in environments with radiation levels that would sterilize most known life forms? Vorthak's neck sack had settled into a distinctly uncomfortable shade of gray. Such organisms would represent impossible biological configurations. Sure, that makes total sense, the human agreed. I mean, obviously, if such things existed, they'd probably revolutionize our understanding of biological adaptation. 23 advanced intellects from across the galaxy suddenly found themselves contemplating a deeply unpleasant possibility that their theoretical understanding of biological adaptation might have some rather significant blind spot. And in the back row, one primitive biped from an insignificant world continued taking notes with the kind of focused attention that suggested their questions were far from over. By week 5, Professor Vorthak had developed what could charitably be described as a nervous tic. His neck sack no longer maintained its confident azure, instead flickering between uncertain yellows and mildly panicked oranges, whenever the human raised that primitive appendage. The rest of the class had begun to exhibit their own species-specific signs of intellectual discomfort. The crystalline collective's representative had developed a stress fracture, while the gas-form student kept condensing into worried clouds. Today's lecture topic was radiation resistance and biological impossibilities, which, in retrospect, Professor Vorthak should have seen coming like an asteroid aimed directly at his academic credibility. As we all understand, Vorthak began, his voice carrying slightly less authority than usual. Ionizing radiation represents one of the universe's most absolute biological barriers. Even the most advanced species require significant technological shielding to survive exposure levels above 10,000 standard units. The class nodded, though with noticeably less enthusiasm than in previous weeks. They'd learned to brace themselves for what was inevitably coming from the back row. The Arcturian shield weavers, Vorthak continued, determined to regain his academic footing, represent the pinnacle of evolutionary radiation resistance. Through sophisticated cellular modification, they can survive up to 50,000 units for brief periods before requiring technological intervention. That's impressive, the human said, and for a moment, hope flickered in Vorthak's neck sac. How brief are we talking? The hope died, approximately 6 standard time units. 6 hours, the human mused, and at what radiation level do their cellular modifications start to break down? Vorthak consulted his datapad with the resigned air of someone who already knew this wasn't going to end well. Cellular degradation begins at approximately 75,000 units. Interesting, the human said, making another note. So, they're really well adapted for short-term exposure to moderately high radiation, but they'd still need to evacuate or use technology for anything more intense or long-term. Yes, that's correct, Vorthak admitted, his sac now cycling through defeated grays. Yendri, who had spent 3 years researching radiation-resistant organisms for her doctoral thesis, decided to salvage the situation. Perhaps our exchange student doesn't fully understand the scale we're discussing. 50,000 radiation units would instantly kill most primitive organisms. This represents the absolute peak of biological adaptation. The human looked genuinely thoughtful. Oh, I understand it's lethal. I was just curious about whether you'd studied any organisms that could handle higher levels. Higher levels are biologically impossible, declared Nexus, a vegan whose species had eliminated vulnerability to radiation by simply existing as pure energy during exposure. The quantum mechanics of cellular cohesion dictate absolute limits to biological radiation resistance. The silence that followed was so complete that the room's atmospheric processors seemed loud by comparison. 23 advanced intellects performed the galactic equivalent of mental double-takes. Vorthak's voice trailed off as his neck sac cycled through colors that had no known translation. Impossible, Yendri finished, though her crystalline structure was resonating at frequencies that suggested severe stress. No biological organism could maintain cellular integrity at such level. Right, the human nodded. That would be crazy. But hypothetically, what would you call an organism that could not only survive 1.5 million units, but actually seemed to thrive in radiation environments, like reproduce and grow faster when exposed to higher levels? Professor Vorthak's neck sac went completely transparent, which in his species was the physiological equivalent of existential crisis. Such an organism would represent a complete contradiction of established biological principles. Yeah, that would be wild, the human agreed. Almost as wild as organisms that could survive in the vacuum of space. You know, no atmosphere, no pressure, temperatures around -270 degrees, direct cosmic radiation. The Andromedan gasweaver made a sound that translated roughly to "oh," or, the human continued conversationally, organisms that could be completely dehydrated for decades and then just come back to life when you add water. That would be pretty weird too, right? Nexus, whose pure energy form was starting to flicker unstably, managed to ask, Are you suggesting that such organisms exist? The human looked around the room at 23 faces displaying various species-specific expressions of dawning horror. Well, I mean, I'm just a primitive from a backwater world. But we do have these things called tardigrades back home. Tardigrades. Vorthak's voice was barely a whisper. Water bears. Some people call them tiny little guys, about as simple as you can get. 8 legs, kinda cute in a microscopic way. The human paused. They're pretty much indestructible. The classroom had achieved a level of silence typically reserved for funeral services or the moments before academic careers imploded. When you say indestructible, Yendri began, her crystalline form now showing several new stress fractures. Oh, they can survive pretty much anything. Vacuum of space. Check. Radiation levels that would sterilize most environments. Check. Temperatures from near absolute zero to well over boiling. Check. Complete dehydration for 30 years. Then just add water and they're good as new. Check. The human shrugged. They're basically just normal Earth organisms. Normal? The word came out as a collective gasp from multiple species. Sure, we've got lots of organisms like the extremophile bacteria that live in boiling acid. Others that thrive in conditions that would melt most metals. Some that eat radiation for breakfast. The human looked genuinely puzzled by their reactions. I mean, Earth's kind of a rough neighborhood. You adapt or you die. Professor Vorthak's neck sac had now achieved a shade of transparent that suggested complete psychological shutdown. Around the room, 23 doctoral theses began crumbling in real time as their foundational assumptions revealed themselves to be not just wrong but spectacularly embarrassingly wrong. Your world, Nexus managed to say, is populated by organisms that routinely survive conditions we consider impossible. Well, the human said thoughtfully, when you put it like that, I guess so, but we always figured that was normal. I mean, life finds a way, right? In the profound silence that followed, you could almost hear the sound of galactic scientific orthodoxy collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. The Xerian Prime Institute of Advanced Xenobiological Studies had never experienced anything quite like the great. Within 72 hours of what would later be known as the Tardigrade revelation, the Xenobiology department had transformed from a bastion of intellectual superiority into something resembling a cosmic-scale existential crisis support group. Professor Vorthak's office had become ground zero for academic devastation. His neck sac had been stuck on transparent for 3 days straight, cycling occasionally through shades of beige that roughly translated to my entire career is meaningless. Stacks of research papers covered every surface, each one marked with notes like completely wrong and how did we miss this. The human who had somehow become the most reluctantly famous student in galactic academic history sat in the corner trying very hard to look invisible, while 23 of the galaxy's brightest minds had various species-specific nervous breakdowns around them. My thesis, Yendri was saying, her crystalline form now sporting so many stress fractures she looked like a shattered chandelier. 3 years of research on theoretical limits of radiation resistance in advanced organisms. 3 years. At least your thesis was only wrong, muttered Nexus, whose pure energy form kept flickering between states of existence. My entire dissertation was titled Why Biological Consciousness Cannot Survive Vacuum Exposure. A definitive analysis. I literally used the word definitive. The Andromedan gasweaver made a sound that translated roughly to sobbing, which was impressive given that his species communicated through controlled atmospheric disturbances. I've been studying environmental adaptation for two decades of being completely fundamentally embarrassingly wrong about everything. Professor Vorthak looked up from a paper he'd been staring at for the past hour. According to the preliminary data the exchange student provided, he said in the hollow voice of a being whose worldview had been systematically demolished, Earth organisms don't just survive extreme conditions, they actively seek them out. The bacteria that live in nuclear reactor cores, the human offered helpfully, they actually eat radiation. It's like imagine if instead of running away from fire, you decided to use it as a breakfast cereal. 23 highly advanced intellects contemplated this analogy and found it deeply, profoundly disturbing. We need to revise everything. Vorthak continued, his neck sac now a shade of gray that suggested complete academic capitulation. Every theory, every model, every foundational principle of xenobiological adaptation. The university administration is already asking questions, added Dr. Faxis, whose tentacles had been tied in nervous knots for the past hour. Apparently word has spread to other departments. The theoretical physics division wants to know if our impossible organisms violate any other fundamental laws they should know about. The human raised a tentative hand. I don't want to make things worse, But there are also the organisms that can survive being shot out of a cannon into space, and the ones that can regenerate from virtually any injury, and the fungi that are basically immortal unless you actively kill them. And stop, Vorthak said weakly. Please. My sack can't handle any more transparency. A knock at the door interrupted the collective wallowing. A messenger drone hovered in, projecting a holographic notice from the university's academic review board. Emergency department meeting scheduled for tomorrow. The drone announced in the kind of cheerfully oblivious tone that suggested it had no idea it was delivering an academic death sentence. Topic: complete revision of xenobiological curriculum in light of recent Earth organism discovery. All faculty and graduate students required to attend. The drone buzzed away, leaving behind a silence so complete it seemed to have its own gravitational field. Well, the human said finally, if it helps, most of us back home think of these organisms as pretty normal. We're usually more impressed by things like, consciousness shifting and dimensional travel. That stuff sounds way cooler than just being really hard to kill. Really hard to kill, Nexus repeated faintly. Your species describes surviving nuclear warfare and cosmic radiation as really hard to kill. I mean, when you put it like that, it does sound kind of intense, the human admitted. But honestly, I was just trying to pass this class. I never meant. They gestured vaguely at the room full of academically devastated beings. Revolutionize our understanding of biological adaptation across the galaxy, Vorthak suggested. Yeah, 6 months later, the Xerian Prime Institute had been renamed the Earth-Centric Institute for Practical Xenobiology. Professor Vorthak's new textbook, Why Everything We Thought We Knew About Adaptation Was Wrong, a humbling introduction to Sol 3 organisms, had become required reading across the galaxy. His neck sack had finally recovered enough to display a resigned shade of blue, though it occasionally flickered to transparent when students asked particularly pointed questions about his previous work. The human had somehow managed to pass advanced theoretical xenobiology with the highest marks in the class's history, despite never actually intending to become the galaxy's foremost expert on comparative biological resilience. Their final project, a simple overview of Earth's extremophile organisms, had been published in the Journal of Galactic Biology, and immediately became the most cited paper in xenobiological history. 23 doctoral students had completely rewritten their theses. The new titles included Tardigrades, Why Everything We Thought We Knew About Biological Limits Was Wrong, Nuclear-Powered Bacteria, A Study in Academic Humility, and How a Single Exchange Student Made Me Question Everything, an autoethnographic analysis of scientific hubris. And somewhere in the university archives, carefully preserved for future generations of humbled academics, sat the original recording of Professor Vorthak's confident declaration that primitive organisms lack sophisticated adaptive mechanisms necessary for true evolutionary flexibility. The galactic academic community had learned a valuable lesson about the difference between theoretical sophistication and practical adaptation. It turned out that when it came to actual survival, the primitive organisms from the rough neighborhood of Sol 3 had been writing the advanced textbooks all along. The rest of the galaxy had just been too intellectually superior to read them.